Hi, Maureen here for Detail Church. This week I'm going to present a series on how to read music. I realized that not everyone learned to read music when they were in school, and some of us have just plain old forgotten. So this set of lessons will go over basic music reading skills, and today we're just really going to go over straight basic things. We're going to talk about how the music is organized and the very first things that you see as you start looking at a piece of music. So you will see here is our staff. The staff is made up of 5 lines, and those 5 lines make 4 spaces. We always count from the bottom to the top. So if someone looked at you and said, oh, that note is on line 1, that is the one at the very bottom. If someone said, oh, that note is in space 4, that is the highest space that you see on the graphic with that short little arrow. So the staff gives us where we place our notes. And as we expand our staff, it's going to give us places to add measures, which help us create organization. So for this lesson, I need you to pretend like you're looking at a piece of music for the very first time and you're at the very beginning. So once you find that you have staff, the next thing you need to look at is the clef. The first clef we're going to introduce is the treble clef. This is the one most people remember from school because everyone remembers every good boy does fine and face. We're going to talk about those letters and why they are important in a different lesson, but this is your treble clef. Sometimes the treble clef is also called the G clef. Some people thought that it looked like a fancy script G, so it got the nickname the G clef. But it has that name for a different reason. If you look at the curl at the very end of the clef, you'll see that it almost circles around the second line of the staff. If you remember your Every Good Boy Does Fine from music class, you remember that line 2 is named G for good. So since we circle around that line, we sometimes call this clef the G clef. So in turn, your treble clef has a friend, and his name is the bass clef. I find that a lot of people just don't like the bass clef, whether you had to play piano as a kid and you were like, oh, bass clef, left hand, or you just didn't like that it wasn't Every Good Boy Does Fine and face. I'm not really sure. But this is your bass clef. So just like its name suggests, the bass clef is responsible for our lower pitched notes. Our treble clef is responsible for our higher pitched notes. So the bass clef has a couple symbols that really give it its secondary name. So just like the treble clef was known as the G clef, our bass clef is known as the F clef. You'll see that it has 2 distinct places where it is larger. So the shape itself is a backwards C. At the very top of that curl, we have a big chunky spot, and it sits right on line number 4. Then we have 2 dots after the backwards C, and those are in spaces 3 and space 4. All of this draws attention to the 4th line of the bass clef. If you remember your bass clef, you remember that good boys do fine always. I'm going to teach you a different phrase. But if you do know that phrase, you know that line 4 is F for fine. So that big chunky spot at the beginning of the clef is on that 4th line for the F, and your 2 dots are on either side of the 4th line, which is F. So sometimes your bass clef can be called the F clef. There are other clefs, and we're going to talk about them in another lesson. So if you're going, but wait, I play the viola, don't worry, I got you, and you will appear in another lesson. So if you ever choose to play, let's say, a tuba, you would read one singular line of bass clef. If you decided you were going to play the flute, you would play one singular line of treble clef. But if you are going to play an instrument that requires you to play 2 different things at the same time, for example, the piano, or maybe the organ, you're going to read on something called the grand staff. So here's your grand staff. It is a combination of 2 clefs. We've got one at the top for our right hand and one at the bottom for our left hand. typically we have a treble clef on top and a bass clef line on bottom. This can change, but that is a story for a very different day. At the beginning, we see something different. This, to me, looks like a mustache. Why? I don't know, but it just always reminds me of a mustache or the paintings of the ocean with the birds flying over them. That's what I think of when I see the brace. The brace simply is at the beginning of the music and tells us that we need to play both of these lines at the same time. You won't see this on single line instruments, so maybe you have somebody that plays clarinet. They will not have a brace at the beginning of their music. They just have lines of treble clef music as they go. The brace very much tells us to play them at the same time. So yes, you have one hand reading one set of letters for lines and spaces. The other hand is reading a whole different set of letters for lines and spaces. As complicated as that sounds, as a person who's been doing it for over 30 some years now, it gets easier. I can read most things pretty easily with a treble and a bass clef. And as a person who teaches it, at first it is confusing and it can be a headache, but the more you do it, the easier it gets. So if you've ever wanted to try piano, I promise you it's not nearly as scary as you think it is. It just takes a little practice. So now that we have discussed our clefs, if you've ever started reading a piece of music, the first thing you see is the clef. The next thing you see is the key signature. Now we're not going to dive real deep into what a key signature represents, but sometimes you just need to know it's there. So the key signature always comes after your clef. If you're in the key of C, there is nothing there. So if you happen to pull out something and we're like, but there's no key signature, that is a key signature. No sharps, no flats is a key signature. The key signature I have up on the screen is comprised of 3 sharps. These 3 sharps mean to me that I need to know those 3 notes are sharp for the entire song or until I see the next key change. So the sharp sign is the tic-tac-toe sign. The center box, wherever that is what is sharp. So if you look at the very first one, you'll see that line number 5 goes straight across like I won tic-tac-toe, which I never do, by the way. So that tells me that whatever note line 5 is going to be sharp. In this case, it is an F, and all of the Fs for the entire song will be sharp. The next one is a C, so all of my Cs are sharp for the rest of the song. And the very last sharp there is a G, so all of my Gs are sharp for the rest of the song. It's hard sometimes to remember them. I've taught many a student who, when we add a new key signature, the newest one is the one that kind of slips your mind. The nice thing is, because keys are structured in a very specific way, that you will notice you're missing it because it sounds wrong. If you played, this is the key of A, if you happen to miss all of your C sharps and play them as C naturals, you would know. It would sound drastically different. And that's just because key signatures are structured in specific ways to make pleasant sounds. I guarantee you, you skip the C sharp, you're going to have a very different sounding song. And we'll talk about more about key signatures as we dive deeper into music reading skills. So as you're reading, you've got your clef. After your clef is your key signature. After that, you're going to find the time signature. The time signature is super important for many reasons. It tells me 2 different things. It tells me how many beats are in a measure. We're going to talk about measures in just a minute. But the measures help us keep our music organized. So that 4 on top tells me that there are going to be 4 beats in one measure. Sometimes you'll have a 3 on top. You can have a 2 on top. Honestly, you can have a 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I've had 12s. I've had 16s. You can really have whatever number on top, just depending on how crazy of a composer you had. The bottom number is a big deal that most people actually don't know what it talks about. The bottom number in this case is a 4, and it tells me what type of note gets 1 beat. So that 4 to me means quarter note. If you think of that as a fraction and you replace the top number with a 1, you'd have a 1 over a 4. And some of you know that that reduces down to a quarter. So that would mean a quarter note gets 1 beat. Sometimes it'll be an 8 on the bottom. So 1 over 8 is an eighth, and that would mean an eighth note gets 1 beat. Sometimes it can be a 2, so 1 over 2 is a half, and a half note gets 1 beat. So that number, though most people ignore it because a lot of the time it's just a 4, is important because it tells you which note to count as 1 beat. So for my handbell friends, we played a song not too long ago in 9/8 time, which meant that each of our eighth notes received 1 beat. And we had 9 eighth notes in each of our measures. But for this example, we are in 4/4 time. So we would have a quarter note being 1 beat. So we could have 4 quarter notes in each of our measures. So speaking of those measures, here they are. A measure is just used to make our music more organized and easier to read. You'll notice that a measure is made up of a vertical line stretching from line 1 up to line 5. If you're reading on the grand staff, it will go all the way from line 5 of the treble clef all the way down to line 1 of the bass clef. It will cut through that empty space in between, because really in real life it's not empty space. That's where we put our ledger lines. But again, a topic for a different day. This is just used to make our music easier to read. I know that I will read 4 beats. I will find a line, and then I'm going to start over. If you look at older music like Gregorian chant, they actually wrote music to be more ornate looking and not so easy to read. Sometimes they would write them in circles, and they would use what looked like squares, and we would call them weird things like semiquavers. As much fun as Gregorian chant music is to read, it lacked organization and it lacked a steady beat and something to follow. So honestly, we could write music without the measures. It could be one giant measure of 276 counts. It could be that. But that would be very hard to read. And if you, heaven forbid you got lost, because that I can only imagine would be really hard to get back on task. So the measures just help us to keep it organized and easier to read. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we dive into reading rhythms in one of our future lessons. So we have done the clef, followed by the key signature and the time signature. We've organized our music into measures. Now you've gotten to the end of the song. And oh no, you found this symbol. So this is called the repeat sign, and it does exactly what its name suggests. When you find it, it means you're going to repeat that section. Now, the problem is the repeat sign has 2 different ways it functions. It either goes back to a matching end. So it'll look like brackets. You'll find one repeat sign over here, and you'll find its matching repeat sign, and you'll play just whatever happened inside of those 2 again. And if you've ever had to play a longer work like a sonata, I speak from experience. You get to page 6 and you find a repeat sign, your heart sinks to the floor because you know you haven't seen another repeat sign. And you have to go all the way back to the beginning. So the repeat sign can either stay within one section of music, or it sends you all the way back to the beginning. There are a lot of repeat signs in the lesson books that I use as a teacher. And those typically will just have you play the entire page one more time instead of writing it a second time, maybe for a change in dynamic or maybe a change in octave. As a professional player, I have seen them many times in sonatas and larger works where if they wrote it out a second time, it was many extra pages. And instead of your sonata being 22 pages, it would have been like 40 pages by the time you threw in all of the repeats. So yes, as a professional, I've cried many times finding a repeat sign and going, oh, Mozart, why did you want me to play that again? But it's just what he wanted, and he wanted you to play that second section one more time. And that's okay, because it was good music. So you'll find repeat signs look very similar to my next symbol. So do note that this repeat sign has 2 dots. Our next symbol is the one that means the end. Everyone enjoys a good end, and this is the symbol for the end. It looks very similar to your repeat sign. The repeat sign has 2 dots placed in spaces 2 and 3. The double bar, which tells you it's the end of the song, means that it doesn't have any dots. You don't have to go back anywhere. So As common sense as it sounds that this means the end, sometimes that doesn't mean the end of the entire thing. Sometimes the double bar means it's the end of that particular movement. So again, as a professional player, I've played many sonatas in my time. So I might get to the end of the first movement and I would find the double bar. That doesn't mean that it's the end of the entire sonata. It means that it is the end of that movement. So though it means the end, it is not the end. But for the most part, in anything we do at the church, you're going to find a double bar and it means the end. For my choir people, we've seen it many times. There's nothing else after that. Same with handbell people. There's no more pages to turn. It just means that the song has come to an end. So those are our basic symbols that help us keep our music organized. We go straight from our clef to the key signature to the time signature, and that tells us all the upfront information that we need to know. Then our notes will be written in those measures that help them keep them organized. And at the end, you might have a repeat sign that sends you back to play something again, or you have just reached the end with your double bar. Well, this is the end of lesson 1. I hope that it helps you understand basic music reading skills a little bit more. We'll dive more into a lot of this information as we start lesson 2. We're going to dive into clefs, we're going to dive into note reading, we're going to dive into rhythms. We've got lots to cover. So I hope you come back and join me for lesson 2. Thanks again for joining me and have a great rest of your day.